Good day everyone. For this video, we will tackle about the School of Thought Generative Linguistics. I will discuss what is generative linguistics, where do generative term borrow, what is grammar, and who is the theories that involved to the generative linguistics and his approaches. What is generative linguistics? It is a school of thought within linguistics that makes use of a concept of a generative grammar. The term generative is a concept borrowed from mathematics, not in science, not in linguistics, but in mathematics, indicating a set of definition rather than a system that creates something. It is most closely associated with the work of Noam Chomsky, beginning with what is collectively known as the standard theory that set out what a model of grammar should be able to describe. What is grammar? Grammar is the set of language rules that indicates the structure and interpretation of sentences that native speaker of a language can accept as belong to their language. In other words, grammar is a set of rules that explains how words are used in a sentence or how words are used in a language. It also refers to the set of rules of structure of language, including syntax or this arrangement of words to form phrases and sentences, and morphology, the study of words and how they are formed. Chomsky's approach is characterized by the use of transformational grammar, a theory that has changed greatly since it was first promulgated by Chomsky in his 1957 book Syntactic Structures, and by the assertions of a strong linguistic nativism, and therefore an assertion that some set of fundamental characteristics of a human language must be the same. The term generative linguistics is often applied to the earliest version of Chomsky's transformational grammar, which was associated with a distinction between the deep structure and the surface structure of a sentence. The primary components studied by experts in generative grammar include syntax, structure of sentences, semantics, linguistic meaning, phonology, sound pattern of language, and morphology, structure, and the meaning of words.
What is generative grammar? Generative grammar is a theory of grammar first developed by Noam Chomsky in 1950s that is on the idea that all humans have an innate language capacity. This theory accepts as a basic premise that native speakers of a language will find sentence grammatical or ungrammatical, and that these judgments gives insight to the rules governing the use of that language. Generative versus descriptive. Generative grammar is distinct from other grammars such as prescriptive grammar, which attempts to establish standardized language rules that deem certain usage right or wrong, while descriptive grammar, which attempts to describe language as it is actually used, including the study of pidgins and dialects. The main principle of generative grammar is that all humans are born with an innate capacity for language and that this capacity shapes the rules for what is considered correct grammar in a language. The idea of an innate language capacity or a universal grammar is not accepted by all linguists. Some believe to the contrary that all languages are learned and therefore based on certain constraints.
The generative grammar or universal grammar believes that the children, when they are very young, are not exposed to enough linguistic information to learn the rules of grammar. That the children do in fact learn the rules of grammar is proof, according to some linguists, that there is an innate language capacity that allows them to overcome the poverty of the stimulus.
As generative grammar a theory of competence, one way to test its validity is by what is called grammatically judgmental task. This involves presenting a native speaker with series of sentences and having them decide whether the sentence is grammatical, which is acceptable, or ungrammatical, which is unacceptable. For example, if the native speaker would judge the sentence, "the man is happy," it is acceptable to them because the words have clear relationship or the sentence itself have clear meaning. On the other hand, the sentence, "happy man is the," is unacceptable because of its complicated structure. By that, we can make certain assumptions about the rules governing how parts of speech should be in order, just like our sentence, "the man is happy." The subject and the verb are in its correct places that makes the sentence understandable and clear, which is also referred to as grammatical sentence or acceptable by a native speaker.
In language teaching and learning process, generative transformational grammar is also the most important one for the students to know the rules how they produce sentences grammatically.
Generative grammar refers to a particular approach to the study of syntax, attempts to give a set of rules that will correctly predict which combinations of words will form grammatical sentences. Originates in the work of Noam Chomsky beginning in the late 1950s. Models of transformational grammar. First, Standard Theory 1957 to 1965. It corresponds to the original model of generative grammar laid out by Chomsky 1965. A core aspect of standard theory is a distinction between two different representations of a sentence called deep structure and surface structure. The two representations are linked to each other by transformational grammar. According to Grover Hodgson, Essential Introductory Linguistics, Blackwell in 2000, a deep structure is the underlying form of a sentence before rules like auxiliary inversion and WH fronting apply. After all, raising apply plus relevant morphological and phonological rules as for forms of do. The result is the linear concrete surface structure of sentences ready to the given phonetic form. Deep structure is an abstract representation of a sentence. It can be represented in the form of a hierarchical tree diagram or phrase structure tree depicting the abstract grammatical relationships between the words and phrases within a sentence. Surface structure corresponds to the version of a sentence that can be spoken and heard. Surface structures are derived from the deep structures by a series of transformations. Examples: the dog bit the cat. It is an example of deep structure. On the other hand, the example of surface structure is the cat was bitten by the dog, where an optional transformation called passive had applied.
And now let's proceed to Extended Standard Theory, 1965 to 1973. The so-called Extended Standard Theory was formulated in the late 1960s and early 1970s. Its features contains syntactic constraints and generalized phrase structure of the X-bar theory. In linguistics, X-bar theory is a theory of syntactic category formation. It embodies two independent claims. First, that phrases may contain intermediate constituents projected from a head X. Second, that this system of projected constituency may be common to more than one category. According to Noam Chomsky, within the framework of extended standard theory, a view that deep structure exists as a distinct level of syntactic structure of which lexical insertion occurs and which serves as the input to the transformational component is maintained.
Revised extended standard theory is a strict delimitation of the different grammatical components, that is syntax, semantics, as well as phonology, stylistics, and pragmatics. The extension is due to the range of semantic rules, some of which should be allowed to operate with the surface structure as input. Features of surface structure relevant to the semantics include the various functions of stress and intonations, aspects of quantification and the focus in a sentence, which provides information concerning sentence presupposition. So we have here the list and our example of surface structure and deep structure.
What is relational grammar? Relational grammar was introduced in the 1970s as a theory of grammatical relations and relation change, for example, passivization, dative shift, and raising. Furthermore, the idea behind relational grammar was that transformation as originally designed in generative grammar were enabled to capture the common kernel of passivization across languages. In linguistics, relational grammar is a syntactic theory which argues that primitive grammatical relations provide the ideal means to state syntactic rules in universal terms. Relational grammar began as an alternative to transformational grammar. Relational grammars are one of the higher dimensional grammar formalisms that have been proposed for representing visual. How is it used in a sentence? Relational grammar uses more of traditional terms of subject, object, and indirect object. The constituents that serve as an argument to predicates are numbered. The numbering scheme for relational grammar are subject 1, object 2, indirect object 3. Example of how relational grammar is presented. Mary left the piano. As mentioned before, relational grammar deals with predicates by numbering them. In the shown figure, 1 represents the subject, P represents the predicate, while 2 represents the object. It is for this very basis that relational grammar is born.
The fifth model of transformational grammar is the government or binding theory. Take note that this theory is a dominant theory of grammar in today's linguistics, and this theory is receiving increasing attention from investigators of normal and disordered language behavior. This theory is based on the principles in parameter theory, which states that there is a finite set of fundamental principles common to all natural languages and a finite set of binary parameters that determine the range of permissible variability in language. Government or binding theory is a theory of syntax and a phrase structure grammar in the tradition of transformational grammar developed principally by Noam Chomsky in the 1980s. The name refers to two central sub-theories of the theory. So, di ba, in a theory kay the government or binding man? So, the first one is the government. The government, which is an abstract syntactic relation applicable, among other things, to the assignment of cases. Tapos, ang isa kay binding. So, the binding which deals chiefly with the relations between pronouns and the expressions with which they are referential. So, let me give you two examples of the government or binding theory. First example is that John saw his mother. Consider that example as shown in the screen using simply phrase structured trees. So, the noun phrase John commands his because the first parent of the noun phrase contains his. John and his are also co-referential because they refer the same person or even the same thing. So, therefore, John binds his. So, in that example, it is obvious that co-referential means connected si John sa his, knowing na John and his dapat related sila by each other and subjected sila. The second example is that the mother of John likes himself. So, on the other hand, the ungrammatical sentence, the mother of John likes himself, John does not command himself, so they have no binding relationship despite the fact that they co-refer. So, in an example, more like opposite sila sa given na first example.
The minimalist program of 1990 to the present. In linguistics, the minimalist program is a major line of inquiry that has been developing inside generative grammar since the early of 1990s, starting with a 1993 paper by Noam Chomsky. In the Minimalist program of 1995, the latest step in the continuous development of transformational generative grammar, Chomsky provided a radically new approach to the implementation of his underlying ideas. Even the ubiquitous phrase structure rules have been eliminated from the theory to a large degree. Minimalist program aims at the further development of ideas involving economy of derivation and economy of representation.
Strength of generative grammar. This grammar will generate well-formed syntactic structures of the language. This grammar will have a finite number of rules but will be capable of generating an infinite number of well-formed structures. The rules of this grammar give recursiveness, that is the capacity to be applied more than once in generating a structure. This grammar is also capable of revealing the basis to other phenomena, how some superficially distinct sentences are closely related, how some superficially similar sentences are in fact distinct. The use of transformations highlighted the multi-layered nature of grammatical structures and how what you see is not always what you get. For example, how does one get from the active to passive voice? What operations must occur? Might the failure to acquire some of these operations by adult L3 speakers show the amazing language building capacity of the child brain? Some of this multi-trial analysis went quite a ways toward explaining and clarifying linguistic complexity that are more logically concise than previous molded, traditional approaches to teaching syntax. They brought an almost mathematical clarity to questions of language that had always seemed opaque. Weaknesses of generative grammar. According to Silalahi 1993, it is far from clear what contribution generative transformational grammar is likely to make to language teaching methodology. So many teachers of English as a second language assume that generative transformational grammar is pedagogically unadaptable to the needs of a secondary curriculum. It means that it is not applicable to language teaching. So there are two important reasons. The first reason is that the application of the theory is directed more towards linguists, psychologists, and mathematicians than towards teachers of English. The second reason is that the criticism of the theory by other linguists made the concept more applicated.
Other examples are as follows. Tree the dog barks at. The dog barks at the tree. Boy the Myrna saw. Myrna saw the boy. Small horse with a girl. The girl with small horse. How that's you it say. That's how you say it. Table the reads at the child. The child reads at the table. Go home to I want. I want to go home.